All right, guys, so we said we're going to talk about OCTs. This is a regular OCT of the retina. Let's start with the basics, and then we'll go into further, more complicated condition and interpretation of it. This is what a normal OCT look like. You can see the retina is pretty flat. I like to look at the OCT starting from the inner retina, from the vitreous RNFL, and then progressively going deeper into the outer retina. So the first thing I look at is the vitreous and the interaction between the vitreous. You can see here the vitreous is attached to the macula. You can see the edges or the interface between the retina and the vitreous. However, if you go to the side, you can see that there is a separation between the vitreous and the retina. So here it's attached centrally and it's separated at the edges. Now the next thing I look at is the RNFL. This is the first hyperreflective layer you can see here, and you can see that if you go on the right side here, the RNFL is thicker. Because the RNFL is thicker on the right side, that tells you that this is the right eye. On that side, the optic nerve will be coming just after the end of the scan. After this, I don't spend too much time in the inner layer of the retina. I go right away into the outer retina in the RPE and the ISOS. The first I look at is the RPE, is the easiest to locate, is the most reflective structure. And just above this, I look at the ISOS, which is this line over here. The ISOS is really the structure that will tell you what's the visual potential in that area for this retina, right? So they pretty much come together because, you know, without RPE, there is no photoreceptors because they come together. So if there is any disruption of the RPE or the ISOS, you know that the vision in that area won't be that great, okay? So let's see some example. Oh, and the last thing I look at is the choroid. You can see, for example, just below the RPE, the blood vessels are pretty small here. You can see those dark areas are the blood vessels. And you can see here, for example, it's a good example of a large choroidal vessel, okay? All right, let's look at some example. This is an example in which the vitreous is separated at the macula and it's attached at the optic nerve. Now, sometimes you're gonna get a scan in which the scan is gonna be like that and you're not gonna see the top of it. And one way to know if the vitreous is attached or not is to look at the texture of the vitreous. You can see that where the vitreous is absent, the color or the texture of it is pretty empty, right? Optically, there is nothing going on there. Whereas if you go into the vitreous, you can see that the vitreous has a texture or noise if you want. So when you don't have any texture here, you can't just assume it's attached. If it's optically empty, you may assume that the vitreous is not present, it's just higher than the scan allow you to see, right? Now, if you go in this scan here, you can see that there is traction of the vitreous at the macula. It's pulling up the macular area. There are two large cysts. However, what's interesting is that even though there is some significant traction here, you can see that the RPE and ISOS are pretty intact, and you'll be surprised to see that this patient probably has pretty good visual acuity, 20/20 or even 20/25, right? Just because the ISOS is preserved. Now, this is a good example of the progression. I'm not sure if it's the same patient, but a progression of vitreous traction on the macula. You can see on the upper scan, this is just what we talked about. There is some traction, ISOS is preserved. Visual acuity in this patient is probably pretty good. Now, if you go on the middle scan, you can see that there is further traction. However, the ISOS, as you can see here, that line start to be disrupted centrally. There is an area of missing ISOS. Then you can assume in that eye, the patient doesn't have so good visual acuity, or actually the vision start to go down because of the lack of photoreceptors centrally. Now, if you go on the last scan, well, the last scan has a large area of missing photoreceptors layer. You can see the ISOS goes here, it goes up, it's lifted, and then there is no photoreceptors centrally. This patient probably doesn't have great visual acuity, okay? Now let's see the next scan. Oh, that's a good example of a patient that has a pseudomacular hole. And well, what do you think? Do you think the visual acuity is bad or is good here? Well, if we go based on what we just said, ISOS is present, RPE is present and intact, this patient probably has good visual acuity, even though it looks a little counterintuitive because the upper retina, the inner retina is disrupted. Same story here, right? The retina is pretty disrupted, probably because of some fractures, something before, but now you can see that the ISOS and RPE is intact, so that probably means this patient has fairly good visual acuity. Now, here's an example of a retina that is not that impressive. You can see there is still some attachment of the vitreous at the macula. However, you can see that in this area, the ISOS, you can see it's continuous, and here the ISOS is missing. This patient probably have some problem with visual acuity because the photoreceptors are just not present centrally, okay? This is an example. That's the last thing I look at an OCT is the choroid. I know there is a lot going on here, but if we just focus on the choroid, you can see that the choroid right here, the dark area just below the RPE, is pretty thin. And some people might think that the white area here is the choroid. Well, in that case, it is not the choroid. In that case, this is the sclera. That's a patient with really high myopia. By the way, the shape of the retina here is a posterior staphyloma, right? The eye is bulging, right? Bulging backward, right? So in those patients with high myopia, the choroid is extremely thin. We call that leptochoroid, by the way, a term that actually nobody uses today. But this is what happened in those patients. So we have the RPE, a very thin choroid, and then after that, the sclera. Now, how do you know if it's the sclera or the choroid? Well, if you look at the texture of it, the sclera has a uniform pattern, right? You can see it's hyperreflective and there is absolutely nothing going on here. It's just white and reflective. The choroid, as you can see in all the scans here, you see the choroid has texture because it's a mix of blood vessels. So you have hyper and hyporeflective. This is what the choroid looks like, right? And the last case, it's when the choroid is too thick. Not every scan can pick up this. You usually need a EDI OCT to go deep enough, or a swept source OCT that can capture the choroid. You can see the end of the choroid, which is right here, and you can see that the choroid is pretty thick in that case. This is a patient with CSR, central serous retinopathy. And we know that those patients have what we call pachychoroid. That's when the choroid is too thick and it causes leakage below the retina, and that's what causes the fluid to lift up the retina, right? Typically we used to think that the good thickness of a choroid is when the choroid is about the thickness of the retina, more or less, just so you have an idea, okay? All right, so that's about OCT, guys. We'll dive into more complicated condition as we go. I hope you enjoy this, and I'll see you on the next video.